Just before the video begins, please subscribe and like the videos to help the channel grow. Also, leave a comment, good, bad or indifferent. Thanks for watching.
What is the real Brian Wilson then, Brian? What did people need to know?
Not me. Songs.
On a hot August day in 1962, recording sessions for Surfin Safari took place in Capitol's basement studios. Every song on the album was recorded by the Beach Boys themselves rather than session musicians. Nick Vennett is credited as the producer, though Brian and Murray contributed substantially to the album's production. Brian fought to be in charge of the production. David Marks remembered, "Brian did everything. Played, did the arrangements, screwed up the lead sheets himself. He didn't need any help to do that. You listen to those first albums and they sound campy and corny, but Brian was serious." The song Surfin was composed after Dennis had told the group, "Surfin's getting really big, you guys ought to write a song about it."
Dennis, being the avid surfer in the family, really brought to us the concept. Mike Love would tell you that he gave him the names.
I was actually the one that arranged those words.
I can't honestly say that I believe that, because Mike didn't surf either.
At the time, Brian was writing songs with Gary Usher, and they often made decisions on matters by flipping a coin. This inspired the song Heads I Win, Tails You Lose. Country Fair was inspired by a time Usher and Brian visited a country fair in San Bernardino. It took 10 minutes to write the entire thing. 10 Little Indians was an attempt to replace the sound of Joel Perry Richardson's Running Bear. Little Miss America, according to biographer David Leaf, is about the ideal Southern Californian dream girl. Chug-a-Lug's autobiographical lyrics mention Usher, Marks, Carl and Dennis. 409 was inspired by Usher's love of cars. The car sound effect that can be heard on the track is from Usher's own car driving past the Wilsons' home. A 100-foot extension cord had to be plugged into the tape recorder. And Moondog was a cover originally performed by the Gamblers. The album reached number 32 in the US charts. The original liner notes list the members of the group and their roles in the band. It mentions Murray as a longtime songwriter, Mike as the boys' talented cousin, David Marks as a neighbour of the Wilsons, Brian as the oldest of the Wilson boys and the group's leader, Carl as a very accomplished lead guitarist, and mentions Dennis sings and plays the drums. The text finishes by saying, "None of them, incidentally, had any formal training, but they all grew up in an atmosphere where music was a regular part of their lives." 3 months after the release of Surfin Safari, recording for Surfin USA began. Again, production was credited to Nick Vennett, and again Brian was heavily involved in the production. The single Surfin USA had reached number 1, and there was a sense that Brian needed to put more effort into the recording process. Brian began double-taking his vocals to create a fuller sound. He later said, "By the time I got to the album Surfin USA, I was more experienced at producing." He pushed the other Beach Boys in order to get the best vocals possible. "I don't like second-rate vocals," he said. "It's either the best or nothing." Shutdown featured on the album and was also the B-side to Surfin USA. Shutdown in racing slang means to beat someone in a race. The song details a drag race between a Dodge Dart and a Chevrolet Corvette. It's written from the perspective of the Chevrolet driver who is behind in the race but closing in. The song ends before the end of the race with the Dodge still in the lead. The Lonely Sea was an outtake from Surfin Safari. The song features a spoken middle-eight reminiscent of Elvis Presley's Are You Lonesome Tonight. Mike was not originally credited for any of the tracks on the album. His credits for Farmer's Daughter, Noble Surfer and Finder's Keeper were awarded after a 1994 court case. In the US it was released in March 1963 and reached number 2, but it wasn't released until late 1965 in the UK. Surfer Girl was the first album in which Brian would begin to use session musicians.
This kid was into something really, really great, and he was great to work for.
Wrote a song that we recorded and it was in 2 different keys at the same time. The only guy I know who did it besides Brian Wilson was Benjamin Britten.
The track Surfer Girl was released as a single in July 1963. The lyrics were inspired by Judy Bowles, Wilson's first serious girlfriend, whom he had dated for 3.5 years. Brian later said, "I actually created a melody in my head without being able to hear it on piano. I sang it to myself. I didn't even sing it out loud in the car. When I got home that day, I finished the song, wrote the bridge, put the harmonies together and called it Surfer Girl." When recording Catch a Wave, Wilson wrote of the song, "It was more rhythmic. The guitars were more clean and driving, as if to say they didn't want to stop. The piano was played by me and it was perfectly synchronized with the guitars. The 3 different sounds combined to make a unique sound. In My Room was written by Brian and Gary Usher. It featured on the album and was also the B-side to the single Be True to Your School." He stated, "I had a room and I thought of it as my kingdom, and I wrote that song, very definitely, that you're not afraid when you're in your room, it's absolutely true." Usher later said of the song, "I played bass and Brian was on organ. The song was written in an hour. Brian's melody all the way. Murray came in a couple of times and wanted me to leave. Anyway, we got Audrey, who was putting her hair up before bed, and we played it for her. She said, 'That's the most beautiful song you've ever written.' Murray said, 'Not bad, Usher, not bad,' which was the nicest thing he ever said to me." The unique harmony sound was something that Brian had composed previously. Years before, when the Wilson brothers all shared one bedroom, Brian taught Dennis and Carl to sing harmony parts to the song Ivory Tower. When recording In My Room, the 3 brothers began singing and it sounded just like they did years before in their bedroom. Hawaii was released in Australia as a single and was the first Beach Boys song to feature Hal Blaine.
Brian and I became very good friends. He used to come to the house all the time. My daughter would sit on his lap while he played the piano.
Little Deuce Coupe featured on the album and was the B-side to Surfer Girl. The car mentioned in the song is the Ford Model 18, as it was commonly referred to as Deuce Coupe. Brian later said, "We loved doing Little Deuce Coupe. It was a good shuffle rhythm," which was not like most of the rhythms of the records on the radio in those days. It had a bouncy feel to it. This record was my favourite Beach Boys car song. In July 1963, Mike Love hit on the idea to use short instrumental segments of the song in the Beach Boys live set as a way to introduce the band members to the audience. Mike would introduce the band starting with Denny Wilson on drums, Al Jardine on rhythm guitar, Carl lead guitar Wilson, and Brian, our leader, on bass. The album reached number 7 in the US charts. Brian was finally given sole production credit for this album.
I remember the first time we heard girls scream that we thought there was a fire.
The exact dates for the recording of Little Deuce Coupe are currently unknown. Deuce Coupe was released just a month after the Beach Boys' previous album. Due to the fact Capitol were pushing out as much Beach Boys content as humanly possible, there was barely enough time to write any new songs. 4 of the tracks from Little Deuce Coupe, 409, Shutdown, Little Deuce Coupe and Our Car Club had already appeared on previous albums. Despite this, Brian's song arrangements were notably becoming more complex, specifically like songs No Go Showboat and Custom Machine.
Ultimately, I think the Beach Boys meant so much to so many people because of the positivity, and that was me. I was Mr. Positive Thinker.
This was the last Beach Boys album to officially include rhythm guitarist David Marks until 2012's That's Why God Made the Radio. After the album's recording, Wilson re-recorded Be True to Your School for single release on October 28th. It resulted in another top 10 hit. Little Saint Nick was also recorded that month and issued as a Christmas single. Hot Rod magazine gave the Beach Boys the picture that would feature on the album's cover. The album reached number 4 in the US charts. Shutdown Volume 2 was the first album to be recorded without the Beach Boys guitarist Dave Marks. By then he'd left the band due to disagreements with Murray. Recording began in January 1964. Don't Worry Baby was a composition by Brian Wilson and Roger Christian intended for the Ronettes. Brian was awestruck by Phil Spector's Be My Baby and intended Don't Worry Baby to be its follow-up. Spector refused it and instead put out Baby I Love You.
It's well known that he had this, love for Phil Spector's music and wanted to create something as original.
Wilson's lead vocal on the track is considered one of his defining performances, and he later referred to Don't Worry Baby as perhaps the Beach Boys' finest record. The story follows a braggart who agrees to a drag race but soon regrets it. He's then comforted by his girlfriend with the song's title phrase. Christian drew on Wilson's stage fright and romantic insecurities to write the lyrics. Musically, Don't Worry Baby is closely similar to Be My Baby. Both songs start with a standalone drum beat that is then joined by other instruments. Both song verses are in E major and both choruses stop halfway through before another vocalist finishes the phrase. For this album, all of the Beach Boys would play their own instruments. Fun 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 was written by Brian and Mike. It featured on the album as well as a single, with Why Do Fools Fall in Love as the B-side, which also appeared on the album. The lyrics are about a teenage girl who deceives her father so she can go hot rodding in his Ford Thunderbird. At the end, her father discovers her deception and takes the keys from her. The opening electric guitar introduction of the song was based on Chuck Berry's Johnny Be Good. An earlier session was cancelled by Murray Wilson as he had felt dissatisfied with the song. Brian rescheduled the session after discovering what had happened.
And none of us really knew what happened between his dad and himself, because he wouldn't talk about his dad or anything bad.
The Warmth of the Sun was written by Brian and Mike Love. John F. Kennedy had recently been assassinated and the song was written as a tribute to him. It also featured as the B-side to the single Dance, Dance, Dance. Love later said, "The melody was so haunting, sad, melancholy, that the only thing I could think of lyrically was the loss of love, when interest slips and feelings aren't reciprocated. I wrote the lyrics from the perspective of, yes, things have changed and love is no longer there, but the memory of it lingers like the warmth of the sun." According to the music historian Keith Badman, Brian had been disappointed by the simplicity, reliance on filler, and overall rushed quality of Shut Down Volume 2. The album reached number 13 in the US charts. All Summer Long marked the Beach Boys' first LP that was not focused on themes of cars or surfing. Instead, the songs are semi-biographical and relate to the experiences of a typical Southern Californian teenager. The album was recorded between April and May 1964 during the height of Beatlemania and the British invasion.
We were very jealous, of course, of the Beatles.
The success of the Beatles was like if you were surfing and all of a sudden it comes a tidal wave.
Brian sought to raise the quality of the group's sound following the disappointing results of Shut Down Volume 2. All Summer Long contained the band's most complex arrangement and refined vocal performances on a record to date. Wilson later cited All Summer Long as a turning point for the band and his first LP that could compete with Phil Spector and the Beatles. Subsequent to this album, the Beach Boys rarely recorded songs about cars or surfing, but continued to be stereotyped as a group who exclusively sang about such subject matter, even as their musical sophistication continued to grow. Brian later said, "We needed to grow. Up to this point we had milked every idea dry. We milked it effing dry. We had done every possible angle about surfing and then we did the car routine. But we needed to grow artistically." Murray Wilson, who had frustrated the group with his overbearing practices and his disruptive behaviour at recording sessions, had been fired by the band.
We finally said, "Look, we can't deal with you anymore. We got to let you go."
Brian and I fired him as our manager. After a couple of years, he was insufferable.
As for the British invasion, Mike Love recalled, "To varying degrees, all of us in the Beach Boys were rattled, but most of all Brian, who saw the Beatles as a challenge to his emerging position as a leader in pop music. At Brian's behest, the group also spent many more hours than usual refining their vocal performances. It was their last album mixed in stereo until Friends in 1968. I Get Around was written by Brian Wilson and Mike Love. It's an autobiographical song that describes the group's reaction to their newfound fame and success. Mike Love said that it was really about our own experiences, how we had this instant fame, some fortune, had travelled all over the country, but did any of that bring us happiness? Maybe we needed to find a different kind of place. The song was one of several that Brian had based on the experiences of his brother Dennis. The lyrics, "The bad guys know us and they leave us alone," refer to some of the perks that fame brings, as well as the joylessness of starstruck fans. The song was also released as a single that surpassed the Beatles, reaching number 1. It marked an unofficial rivalry between the Beatles and the Beach Boys. All Summer Long encapsulated the album's general theme, with the lyrics offering a list of activities, events, and feelings associated with summertime. The line, "Remember when you spilled Coke all over your blouse," is a reference to Brian's first meeting with his then girlfriend Marilyn Ravel. Changed slightly for the song, as in real life, it was Brian who spilled the drink on her blouse, and it was hot chocolate, not Coke. Little Honda, written by Brian Wilson and Mike Love, pays tribute to the Honda 50 motorcycle. Carl Wilson later said, "Brian wanted me to get this real distorted guitar sound, real fuzzy. It sounded really hot. That was before fuzz became a big deal." The Beach Boys planned to release it as a single before Capitol voiced objections. Brian then gave the song to Gary Usher, who turned it into a hit. We'll Run Away, written by Brian Wilson and Gary Usher, portrays a young couple wishing to elope while the respective parents warn them against such an impulse. It was the last song that Wilson co-wrote with Gary Usher for many years. Wendy was written by Brian Wilson and Mike Love. The song portrays a man's dejection after discovering that the woman whom he thought was his girlfriend was actually romantically involved with somebody else. Brian later named his second-born child Wendy. Girls on the Beach was written by Brian Wilson and Mike Love. It was written in a similar vein to Brian's 1963 song Surfer Girl, but more musically complex. The song later served as the theme to the 1965 Paramount Pictures film The Girls on the Beach, where the Beach Boys made a cameo appearance as themselves. Drive-In was inspired by the group's outings at the Studio Drive-In in Culver City, California. The song gives the listener advice on how to enter a drive-in theatre without paying for admission. Don't Back Down is the last surfing themed song that the Beach Boys recorded during this early era of the band's history. The album reached number 4 on the US charts. The Beach Boys' Christmas album was the group's third album to be released in 1964. The album was devised as a response to Phil Spector's A Christmas Gift for You, an album that Brian had attended recording sessions for. It contained 5 original songs and 7 covers of Christmas classics. Musical historian James Perroni wrote that it is regarded as one of the finest holiday albums of the rock era. The album reached number 6 on the US charts. Following the success of their chart-topping I Get Around single, the Beach Boys' touring schedule became considerably more busy. Around this time, Brian was introduced to marijuana by a new acquaintance. He also began consuming alcohol more frequently than he ever had. Brian suffered a nervous breakdown, starting with a panic attack on a plane, and thereafter decided to stop touring and focus all his attention on studio recordings.
He just was not happy traveling. He was more of a homebody. I think he felt safer in his own environment.
Over 25 studio musicians were used to record the Beach Boys today. The album signaled a departure from their previous records with its orchestral sound, intimate subject matter, and abandonment of car or surf lyrics. Side 1 features an up-tempo sound, while Side 2 consists mostly of introspective ballads. Today showcase more refined performances, denser and richer arrangements, slower tempos, longer structures, and influences drawn from Phil Spector. Brian later said in his memoir the songs were heavily influenced by his use of marijuana. Wilson developed a more personalised, semi-autobiographical approach, with his songs written from the perspectives of vulnerable, neurotic, and insecure narrators. Virtually every song expresses anticipation or apprehensiveness about the future. The album is consistent with the Beach Boys' past records by remaining largely concerned with teenage experiences. Do You Wanna Dance is a cover of the 1958 song by Bobby Freeman. It features Dennis on lead and was recorded at Gold Star Studios, Phil Spector's favourite studio. Good to My Baby was written by Brian Wilson with lyrics added by Mike Love. The story centres around a man responding to criticisms of how he treats his girlfriend. Don't Hurt My Little Sister was written by Brian Wilson with additional lyrics by Mike Love. The story follows a sibling who appears to be infatuated with his sister. The inspiration came from Brian's conflicting feelings for his girlfriend and her two sisters. Brian wrote the song for the Ronettes, modelling the chords and melodies after Spector's songs, and submitted it to Spector. He accepted the song but rewrote the lyrics, renaming it Things Are Changing for the Better. Brian was to play piano on the track, but Spector dismissed him due to a substandard performance.
Brian always thought that he was somehow inferior to Phil Spector. I always thought it was absolutely the other way around. You know, Phil's thing was anger.
When I Grew Up to Be a Man was written by Brian Wilson and Mike Love. The story follows a young man's anxieties of leaving his teenage years and whether age will affect him negatively. In a 2011 interview, Brian commented that when he wrote the song, he had a dismal view of his future. The inspiration for the song came from an argument Brian had with his father Murray. Murray had told Brian, "You'll never be a man," to which Brian responded, "I'm more of a man than you'll ever be." After Murray's death in 1973, Brian proclaimed, "It's making a man out of me." Help Me Rhonda was written by Brian Wilson and Mike Love. The story follows a man's attempt to forget about a previous relationship by starting a new one. Mike Love said that the opening lines drew from his high school experiences. Al Jardine sang the lead vocals, and the song ends with an outro that goes back into the chorus and an audio fade out that goes back to full volume. This technique was used to show the uncertainty of the narrator. Dance 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 was written by Brian Wilson, Carl Wilson and Mike Love. At the time, Brian stated, "The Beach Boys have never sounded better." Side 2 marks the introduction of major 7th and major 9th chords. Please Let Me Wonder was written by Brian Wilson. The story follows a man who fears or maybe even knows his partner doesn't love him, so prefers to fantasize she does. Brian said he did the song as a tribute to Phil Spector. Despite this, the arrangement was in direct contrast to the methods used by Phil Spector in his Wall of Sound. I'm So Young was a cover of the 1958 song by the Students. The song's Too Young to Get Married lyrical theme inspired the later song Wouldn't It Be Nice. Kiss Me Baby was written by Brian Wilson. The song follows the narrator who's trying to repair a broken relationship. Brian was inspired to write the song when walking around the red light district in Copenhagen. He wrote this song days after proposing to his then girlfriend Marilyn Ravel. She Knows Me Too Well was written by Brian Wilson and Mike Love. The story is about a man who is engrossed and obsessed in his own jealousy and insecurity. The high-pitched percussion sound was made by hitting a screwdriver on a microphone boom pole. In the Back of My Mind was written by Brian Wilson. The story follows someone who describes themselves as blessed with everything, yet has suspicions that his happy relationship will someday disintegrate. Fans and critics regard the song as one of the band's masterpieces. Ball Session with the Big Daddy was not a song but a spoof interview with the band. In it, they discussed their recent tour of Europe. The Beach Boys Today reached number 4 in the US charts. The Beach Boys Today had marked a departure from surfing cars, but it had sold below Capitol's expectations. In response, the label pressured the group to produce bigger hits. Summer Days and Summer Nights thus returned the band's music to simpler themes for one last album. Brian combined Capitol's commercial demands with his artistic calling. Summer Days also marked Bruce Johnston's first appearance on a Beach Boys album. As Brian Wilson's stage replacement, he was not yet considered an official member. Wilson appreciated Johnston's skills enough to have him contribute vocally and instrumentally on the album. Johnston would often accompany the group on photo shoots, but he was prohibited from having those pictures published on an album due to pre-existing contracts with Columbia Records. California Girls, which featured on the album, became one of their biggest hits, becoming one of the band's most successful songs globally. Brian had wrote the song during his first acid trip while thinking about women and western scores. He confirmed this on the 2004 documentary Beautiful Dreamer, but later stated in the documentary Long Promised Road it was written the week he took acid, but he was actually sober.
It was just a tremendous vocal arrangement that had subsequently became our opening number for the rest of our career.
According to Mike Love, the lyrics were inspired by the band's first time touring Europe and the UK in November 1964. He stated, "I wanted the song to be a tribute to girls everywhere, not just in the United States, let alone California, but everywhere in the world. I'm Bugged That My Old Man was inspired by Brian Wilson's tumultuous relationship with his father Murray. In the song, the singer's father uses extreme punishments to reprimand minor incidents, resulting in the singer being locked in his room, his windows being boarded up, his surfboards and radio being taken away, his hair cut off, and a meager meal of breadcrumbs and water being the only thing for him to eat." Salt Lake City was written to call attention to the band's major fan base in the city of the same name. The album reached number 2 in the US charts. The Beach Boys Party was recorded in a music studio and presented as an impromptu live recording of a party with informal chatter by friends and family overdubbed later. The record company Capitol wanted an album for the holiday season, but as there was no new material ready, several options were considered, including a greatest hits album and a live album, before the band decided on the party theme. The album featured cover songs by the Beatles, Bob Dylan and the Everly Brothers. Because of its stripped down approach, Party is considered to be the first unplugged typed album. The original release of Party included a sheet of photographs which depicted the band at a party. In order to promote the album, Capitol distributed to dealers 1 million bags of potato chips which bore the album's cover art, intended to be given away to record buyers for free. The song Barbara Ann was released as a single and reached number 13. In October, Brian and his wife, 17-year-old singer Marilyn Ravel, moved from a rented apartment in West Hollywood to a home on Laurel Way in Beverly Hills. He spent the subsequent months contemplating the new direction of the group. Brian began a songwriting partnership with a lyricist named Tony Asher, who wrote jingles for an advertising company. The Beach Boys Party reached number 2 in the US charts. With Pet Sounds, Brian desired to make a complete statement, similar to what he believed the Beatles had done with their newest album Rubber Soul, released in December 1965.
When I first heard it, I flipped. I said, I want to make an album like that.
The version of the album that he heard was the alternative American version, whose track listing had been configured by Capitol to have a cohesive folk rock sound. Albums up until the late 1960s were largely used to sell singles at a higher price point. Brian found that Rubber Soul subverted this by having a wholly consistent thread of music. Spirituality was another core inspiration for the album. Asked about pet sounds in various interviews, Brian frequently emphasised the album's spiritual qualities, saying that he held prayer sessions with his brother Carl and kind of made the recordings a religious ceremony. During his first LSD trip in April 1965, Wilson had what he considered to be a very religious experience. He soon began suffering from auditory hallucinations and for the remainder of the year experienced considerable paranoia. Wouldn't It Be Nice was written by Brian Wilson, Tony Asher and Mike Love. The story describes a young couple fantasizing about the romantic freedom they would earn as adults. Asher said that it was the only song on the album in which he wrote the words to a melody that Brian had already finished. The song was inspired by Wilson's confused infatuations for his sister-in-law, who projected an innocent aura that he wished to capture in Wouldn't It Be Nice.
We knew that Pet Sounds was a very special record, and to us, it was more than a record. It was a new place. It was, popular music coming to a new level.
You Still Believe in Me was written by Brian Wilson and Tony Asher. The story follows a narrator who, while acknowledging their irresponsible behaviour and unfaithfulness, is impressed by the unwavering loyalty of their lover.
We were in here doing Pet Sounds with 10, 12, 14, 18 musicians. Probably the fire department would have thrown us out had they known.
That's Not Me was written by Brian Wilson and Tony Asher. The story follows a man's journey of self-discovery and independence. He comes to the realization he finds happiness with a partner rather than a life of work and solitude. In a 1976 interview, Brian stated, "I think That's Not Me reveals a lot about myself. Just the idea that you're going to look at yourself and say, hey, now look, that's not me. Kind of square off with yourself and say, this is me, that's not me." Don't Talk, Put Your Head on My Shoulder was written by Brian Wilson and Tony Asher. The subject matter involves non-verbal communication between lovers. According to Asher, it's strange to sit down and write a song about not talking, but we managed to do it.
It already showed interest in instruments, new instruments, instruments beyond piano, bass, guitar, and drums.
I'm Waiting for the Day was written by Brian Wilson and Tony Asher. The song is a simple love poem whose narrator wishes to offer his comfort and support to a girl who was abandoned by her former lover. When asked about the song in 2014, Brian said, "There really was no specific inspiration." Let's Go Away for a While was written by Brian Wilson. It is an instrumental track that features 12 violins, a piano, 4 saxophones, an oboe, vibraphones, and a Coca-Cola bottle used as a guitar slide.
He wanted to sing about love, and he wanted to sing about life and about disillusionment.
In 1966, Brian considered the track to be the finest piece of art he had made up until that point. Sloop John B was a cover of a traditional Caribbean folk song. The song was brought to Brian's attention by Al Jardine.
He says, "Oh yeah, I kind of remember that." He says, "Yeah, but I think I liked it." It's just a 3-chord song. I think maybe we should add a little dimension to it.
The only departure from the original comes when the lyrics, "This is the worst trip since I've been born," are changed to, "This is the worst trip I've ever been on." This may have been done as a deliberate reference to acid trips. God Only Knows was written by Brian Wilson and Tony Asher.
The first time I really got what he was doing was God Only Knows.
The story has been interpreted different ways, with some believing it to be a love letter to an unconditional love, and others seeing it as a suicide note following the loss of their partner.
We did have this concern about using the word God in the lyric, and I think we would have given it up if we could have come up with absolutely anything else.
Brian's wife Marilyn interpreted the opening lines as autobiographical from Wilson's point of view.
It's just a very incredible piece of music. It's so brilliantly put together, and I got to sing it.
I Know There's an Answer was written by Brian Wilson, Terry Sashen and Mike Love. The original story criticised people who used LSD as a form of escapism, but Mike Love refused to sing the first drafts of the lyrics, recalling that they had promoted the use of LSD. After voicing his objections, Brian allowed him to revise the song's message to be about finding meaning within oneself and allowing others to live as they wish. Here Today was written by Brian Wilson and Tony Asher. The story is told from the perspective of an ex-boyfriend narrator who warns the listener of the inevitable heartbreak that will result from a newfound love. I Just Wasn't Made for These Times was written by Brian Wilson and Tony Asher. It tells the story of a person alienated by society. Brian later said, "It's about a guy who's crying because he thought he was too advanced, and he thought eventually he'd have to leave people behind. All my friends thought I was crazy to do Pet Sounds." Pet Sounds was written by Brian Wilson. It is the second instrumental track to feature on the album. The track represents the Beach Boys' surf heritage more than any other track on the album, with its emphasis on lead guitar. Caroline No was written by Brian Wilson and Tony Asher. The story follows a man reflecting on his former love and her lost innocence. Brian's then wife said she was unsure whether the track was written about her or a former girlfriend Brian had in school. In a 2005 interview, Brian said that the song wasn't written about anyone, I just used the name Caroline. It's interesting to note the album opens with one of Brian's happiest songs and ends with one of his saddest. Smiley Smile marked the beginning of a downward spiral for the band, musically and commercially. It was received as a simplified version of their then forthcoming album Smile, which Brian had abandoned following his ever-growing mental health problems. The majority of the recording sessions lasted for only 6 weeks at his makeshift home studio. Radio broadcast equipment, a detuned piano, electric bass, found instruments for percussion, and a Baldwin theatre organ were the instruments used that would feature on the tracks. The recording process involved an experimental party-like atmosphere with short pieces of music edited together in a disjointed manner. This combined the engineering methods of good vibrations with the loose feeling of the Beach Boys party.
Here's an album called Smiley Smile by the Beach Boys. Now about this album, Brian, you've done some unusual things here. You've eliminated the echo effects so often used in recording.
We didn't have an echo chamber at the studio, and we just sort of liked the sound without echo, so most of it ended up without echo, you know.
The entire album was recorded by the Beach Boys themselves, with no session musicians employed to record. During the recording of the album, Brian became obsessed with a 3-tier Baldwin organ. This is heard played by Brian throughout the album, with Carl playing most of the bass. This album would be the first in which production credits were given to the Beach Boys instead of Brian Wilson.
Is this sound and material an indication of things to come for such groups as your Beach Boys?
It's not really an indication of things to come for us or anything. We, did it in 3 weeks.
This album has often been cited for having positive effects on listeners experiencing an LSD come-down, and it was used by at least one drug clinic to relieve users from bad trips. Many of the songs on the album were recordings from Brian's Smile sessions, such as Heroes and Villains, Wind Chimes, Wonderful, Vegetables, as well as the single Good Vibrations, which was intended to feature on Smile. Reviews for the album were abysmal. In the description of journalist Nick Kent, Smiley Smile appeared like the single most underwhelming musical statement of the 60s. He went on to say it was a major disappointment for fans, many of whom had expected a work similar to Pet Sounds and the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper. It peaked at number 41 on the US charts. Melody Maker wrote, "Undoubtedly the worst album ever released by the Beach Boys." A controversy involving whether the band was to be taken as a serious rock group had critics and fans divided.
I just kind of ignored people turning their backs on the Beach Boys in America. Around the world, we were selling out, people jumping up and down, going crazy. I thought being all over the world was a pretty interesting thing for some guys that are washed up at 27 years old.
Immediately after the recording of Smiley Smile, sessions began for Wild Honey. The image on the front of the Wild Honey sleeve is a small section of an elaborate stained glass window that adorned Brian's home in Bel Air. It was the second album to credit the Beach Boys as producer instead of Brian Wilson. For the first time since Summer Days and Summer Nights, Mike Love would return to be Brian's main songwriting collaborator. According to Love, the band made a conscious decision to be completely out of the mainstream for what was going on at the time, which was all hard rock / psychedelic music. He stated, "The album just didn't have anything to do with what was going on." By the time of the album's recording, Brian was tired of producing the Beach Boys after having done it for several years, and so he requested that his brother Carl contribute more to the process.
At one time in the early to mid-60s, Brian was very dynamic, resourceful, disciplined in the studio. He was now shattered, afraid, paranoid. That was the last of the super dynamism from Brian. That was 1967.
Recording mostly at their private studio located in Brian's home, the album may be retrospectively viewed as the second installment in a consecutive series of lo-fi Beach Boys albums. According to Brian, people expected me to come up with great orchestral stuff all the time, and it became a burden. We decided to make a rhythm and blues record. We consciously made a simpler album. It was just a little R&B and soul. It certainly wasn't like a regular Beach Boys record. The album differs in many ways from previous Beach Boys records. It contains very little group singing compared to previous albums, and mainly features Brian singing at his piano. The recording sessions lasted only several weeks compared to the several months required for Good Vibrations. Wild Honey was co-written by Mike Love from the perspective of Stevie Wonder singing it. He felt that the album's title was suggestive of both edible honey and honey as in a term of endearment.
That's when Jimi Hendrix made some remark that surfing music is now dead forever. That pretty much spelled the doom for the Beach Boys.
Aren't You Glad is described by Rolling Stone magazine as a loving spoonful type of song with the Beach Boys touch. I Was Made to Love Her was a cover by Stevie Wonder. Darling was one of the album's more developed productions and reworked from the earlier Brian Wilson, Mike Love composition. The song featured a powerful lead vocal by Carl. Wild Honey peaked at number 31 in the US charts. In a January 1968 interview, Brian stated that the group was unsure what their next production would be, but it won't be very long until I come up with a song about meditation. It shouldn't be more than a month. Friends was recorded primarily at the Beach Boys' private studio located within Brian's Bel Air home. It was recorded from late February to April 1968. It was performed, written and produced mainly by the Wilson brothers. Al Jardine later said of the album, "We'd get together in the morning. A lot of activity took place in the kitchen. We were in there as much as in the studio. God, we ate well." When asked as to the level of Brian's input, Mark Lynette and Alan Boyd said that Wilson led the entire project, even on the songs that he did not compose. In a 1976 interview, Brian referred to Friends as his second solo album, the first being Pet Sounds. The album has a relatively short length. Only 2 of its 12 tracks last longer than 3 minutes and 5 run short of 2 minutes. Bruce Johnston described the album as a conscious attempt to make something really subtle that wasn't concerned with radio. He felt the songs didn't represent Brian at full strength. Retrospectively, the album may be viewed as the final installment in a consecutive 3-part series of lo-fi Beach Boys albums. Subject matter ranges from transcendental meditation to bearing children and doing nothing. Meant for You is a 38-second introduction to the album and the shortest song in the group's catalogue. It was originally conceived as You'll Find It Too. Wake the World was the first original songwriting collaboration between Brian and Jardine. Brian later described it as my favourite cut on the album. Passing By is wordless with the melody hummed by Brian. Analay the Healer is about a masseuse Mike Love encountered in Rishikesh. The arrangement consists of only vocals, piano, bass and hand drumming. Little Bird was composed by Dennis Wilson and poet Stephen Kalinich. Brian later said, "Blew my mind because it was so full of spiritualness. He was a late bloomer as a music maker. He lived hard and rough, but his music was as sensitive as anyone's."
Dennis Wilson's talents were highly underrated.
All of a sudden he started to shine. He came into his own.
He was a guy that was not recognized for the gift that he had. I never went to school and found anybody that could write that in college.
Be Still, another Dennis Kalinich song, only featured Dennis's singing and Brian playing organ. Transcendental Meditation was the album's final track. When asked about the song, Dennis explained that the group wanted to get away from anything that sounded too pompous, too religious. It would have been easy to do something peaceful, very Eastern, but we were trying to reach listeners on all levels. Jardine viewed it as a weak effort. Friends peaked at 126 on the US charts. After the group's worst selling album to date, with record sales in the US estimated at 18,000 units, to recuperate the album's poor sales, the band quickly released the standalone single Do It Again.
I went surfing with a friend of mine. That's where that line, "It's automatic when I talk with old friends," comes, because I went with a high school friend, went surfing, I came back, went over to Brian's house, say, "Brian, I went surfing at San Onofre and stuff with my old friend Bill Jackson, and we ought to write a song about it and call it Do It Again." You know?
The song was a self-conscious throwback to the group's early surf songs, and the first time they had embraced the subject matter since 1964. It reached the US top 20 and became their second #1 hit in the UK. Brian Wilson said that by early 1968 the group had begun losing thousands of dollars on stupid things: cars, houses, bad investments, a heck of a lot of corporation money on Brother Records, our own company, and in boosting other artists who just didn't make it and didn't have a single hit. Brian was absent during most of the album's recording after admitting himself into a psychiatric hospital. Brian's issues were not disclosed to the public, and sessions continued in his absence.
Well, we just took up the gauntlet. We just went forward. Carl became more involved, and Dennis and myself. Carl would put his voice in where Brian should have, because Brian wasn't interested.
Once discharged, Brian rarely finished any tracks for the band, leaving much of his subsequent Beach Boys output for Carl Wilson to complete. Dennis said that Brian began to have no involvement at all, which forced the group to find things that he worked on and try and piece it together. The two oldest tracks on 2020 were sourced from the late 1966 sessions for the band's unfinished album Smile. Our Prayer is a wordless hymn composed by Brian, while Cabin Essence is a song written by Brian and Van Dyke Parks. Both tracks were given additional vocal overdubs by Carl and Dennis Wilson in November 1968 at Capitol Records. A Charles Manson song, Cease to Exist, was featured on the album. The title and lyrics were changed to Never Learn Not to Love in order to be more relatable to Beach Boys' audience. The single Do It Again featured on the album along with a 1958 cover, Bluebirds Over the Mountain. Carl produced a rendition of the Ronettes' 1966 song I Can Hear Music, and it was the first time he was given a sole production credit.
In fact, I Can Hear Music, I think, was that on the 2020 album? I Can Hear Music, Brian didn't even sing on it. That was like the first track he didn't sing on.
Dennis wrote and produced more songs that would appear on the album. Be With Me was described as dark and eerie, perfectly capturing the emotions of the era. The album reached number 61 in the US charts. Though 2020 had sold better than their previous album Friends, they remained crippled by an enormous debt that had been partly the result due to two disastrous tours in 1968. Recording sessions for their next album began in January 1969, and the album was produced by the Beach Boys collectively.
It wasn't all roses by any means. It was tough. It was tough being a Beach Boy, particularly during that late 60s, early 70s period.
Working titles for the new album included Reverberation, Add Some Music, and the fading rock group Revival. In contrast to 2020, the record featured a strong group presence with significant writing contributions from all band members. At this point, Brian was increasingly known for his reclusiveness and eccentric behaviour, which affected his reputation within the music industry.
Brian started falling further away, ironically, after we put the studio in his house.
On May 27th, Brian told the music press that the group's funds were depleted to the point that they were considering filing for bankruptcy at the end of the year. Brian said that he hoped that the success of a forthcoming single, Breakaway, would mend the band's financial issues. He had wrote the song with his father, Murray Wilson. It was released on June 16th with the B-side Celebrate the News, a Dennis song, and peaked at number 63 in the US and number 6 in the UK. Shortly before signing with new record label Reprise, the group accumulated enough material for a new album, now titled Sunflower, and assembled a provisional 14-song tracklist for the album. The collection was rejected. Reprise rejected a second track listing, and the third and final master of Sunflower was delivered to the label.
They tried everything to get into the pulse of the hippie movement, which is really sad because the Beach Boys are not hippie movement.
Slip On Through was written and sung by Dennis. Brian recalled, "It was a really dynamic song. Dennis I was very proud of because he really rocked and rolled that one. Dennis did really interesting, energetic things on that. This Whole World was written by Brian, who said it was inspired by love of the world, how I love people, and how people should be free." Brian's wife Marilyn and his sister Diane Ravel also contributed backing vocals. Add Some Music to Your Day is a song with lyrics that are a celebration of music and its presence in daily life. It was written by Brian, Mike Love, and their friend Joe Knott, who was not a professional songwriter. Got to Know the Woman is an R&B song by Dennis that featured backing vocals from female session singers. Deirdre was credited to Bruce Johnson and Brian Wilson. Although Johnson has stated that Brian offered very minor lyrical contributions and that he gave him a 50% share in the song as a favour. It's About Time is an autobiographical rock song about the pitfalls of stardom and fame. It was written by Dennis, Carl, Al Jardine and outside writer Bob Birchman. Tears in the Morning was written by Bruce Johnston. It is a melodramatic song with strings, horns and accordions. Johnston will perform the song during the group's live performances without accompaniment from his bandmates. All I Wanna Do is a reverb-heavy Brian Wilson love song that was originally attempted during the sessions for Smile. Discussing the song in 1995, Brian expressed, "That was one of the songs that had a nice chord pattern, but I think it was a boring song and I thought it wasn't done right." Forever was written by Dennis and his friend Greg Jacobson. Brian praised the song as the most harmonically beautiful thing I've ever heard. It's a rock and roll prayer. Love wrote that it was Dennis's most acclaimed ballad as it captured the raw emotion and bluesy sensibility that he brought to his vocals. Our Sweet Love is a reworking of a friend's outtake, Our New Home. Brian commented, "I wrote that for Carl. After I wrote it I said, hey, he could sing this good, so I gave it to Carl." At My Window is a song by Brian and Jardine about the birds in Brian's backyard. It evolved from a rendition of Raspberry Strawberries, a Wilt Holton composition that was recorded by the Kingston Trio. Cool Cool Water evolved from the Smile track Love to Say Dada, which was initially attempted during the 1967 sessions for Smiley Smile and Wild Honey. A month after the release of Sunflower, Mike Love was hospitalised after a 3-week fast in which he ate only water, fruit juice and yogurt. Subsequently, he had to be replaced for the album's tour. Despite its poor sales, Sunflower had received considerable critical acclaim in the US and in the UK. Jim Miller of Rolling Stone magazine called it, without a doubt, the best Beach Boys album in recent memory, a stylistically coherent tour de force. Another reviewer said Sunflower is far more satisfying, I suspect, than Smile ever would have been. Despite this, it peaked at 151 on the US charts, becoming the lowest selling Beach Boys album of all time. Band promoter and co-manager Fred Vale remembered one meeting with the band in which we were talking about Sunflower not charting and they were wondering why. I said to them, "Listen, this is a phase right now. If you stay the course, your real audience won't forget you. They won't desert you." But the Beach Boys didn't believe in themselves. Surf's Up was recorded between January and July 1971, with the exceptions of a few tracks. Lyrically, Surf's Up addresses environmental, social and health concerns more than the group's previous efforts. Due to Brian's reduced involvement, the vocal arrangements were not as dense as those for Sunflower. Bruce Johnston recalled, "It was strange to be doing vocal arrangements to make it sound like the Beach Boys when we were the Beach Boys. That's a little weird to me." Long Promised Road and Feel Flows were Carl's first significant solo compositions and were recorded almost entirely by himself. Student Demonstration Time, a topical reworking of Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller's R&B classic Riot in Cell Block No. 9, and the environmental anthem Don't Go Near the Water, found Love and Jardine embracing the group's new socially conscious direction. Till I Die was a song Brian had been working on since the mid-1970s.
I think that the last great Brian Wilson song is Till I Die in the Surf's Up album. In terms of the Beach Boys, the great counterpoint harmonies, the incredible lyrics.
It was written while he was suffering from an existential crisis, and he took weeks to refine the arrangement using an electrical drum machine and a crafting harmony-driven, vibraphone and organ-laden background. A Day in the Life of a Tree was written by Brian and is about a tree succumbing to the effects of environmental pollution, as well as the alienation felt by Brian. Johnston said that he wrote Disney Girls 1957 because I saw so many kids in our audiences being wiped out on drugs and wanted to capture the feeling of an era in which people were a little naive but a little healthier. Jardine also contributed Take a Load Off Your Feet, a Sunflower outtake, and Looking at Tomorrow, a welfare song. The title track Surf's Up was taken from the Smile sessions. Brian had given approval for the song to be finished. Dennis recorded 2 songs that never featured on the album. In a September 1971 interview, Dennis stated, "I have a belief in my music and it sounds nothing like it should on the album. It should have a flow on it from one song to another. It didn't sound like the Beach Boys. They thought it did. I said, BS, and pulled my songs off." Surf's Up received generally favourable reviews. Times reviewer described it as one of the most imaginatively produced LPs since last fall's All Things Must Pass by George Harrison and Phil Spector. A Rolling Stone writer stated, "The Beach Boys staged a remarkable comeback. The album reached number 29 on the US charts, becoming their highest charting LP of new music in the US since 1967. Back in 1969, Carl Wilson had attended a nightclub performance by the South African band The Flames in London. Impressed by what he saw, he later invited the group to the United States to sign with the Beach Boys record label, Brother Records.
And he just thought they were great. And he brought them over to the States. Carl wanted to use their skills and incorporated them into the Beach Boys.
The Flames had supported the group and even filled in for absent members on live performances. Carl had took the helm by this point, and on February 29, 1972, the Flames were officially announced as the new additions in the Beach Boys lineup. Their next album would be titled Carl and the Passions So Tough. During this time, Brian Wilson, who had reduced his contributions to the group, was absent for most of the sessions.
There was the record companies demanding that there be Brian Wilson product.
Brian's 3 song contributions were You Need a Mess of Help to Stand Alone, Marcella, and He Came Down. Dennis's 2 song contributions, Make It Good and Cuddle Up, were written with Daryl Dragon and originally intended for a cancelled solo album. Carl and the Passions' So Tough reached number 50 in the US charts. It failed to impress most critics. Rolling Stone's Stephen Davis felt that only 4 tracks were acceptable and that Brian's lack of genuine involvement hurt the album. In late December 1970, the Beach Boys played 3 concert dates in Amsterdam as part of a short European tour. Carl Wilson told a local magazine, "I love this audience. Our last albums 2020 and Sunflower sold poorly in the US. Our financial situation is disastrous, and here we have success. I like this country." The Beach Boys at that point felt they had to do a record outside of California to get away from that whole scene, find a new scene, and create in that new scene. Their next album will be recorded in and titled Holland.
Oh, we did the whole Holland album, really in Brian's absence. We went overseas to try that one out, see if that might stimulate some more creativity, but he still wasn't interested in coming down.
The band had expected to record their Netherlands-based album at a local studio, however the country's few studios were already overbooked. To combat this, they constructed a portable mixing desk to be shipped to Holland.
We put together a studio in Holland, and it was one of the periods of my life where I didn't really know for sure what I wanted to do.
The sessions in Holland lasted from June 3rd to August 15th, 1972. Al Jardine remembered, "It was rough being in Holland. We worked 24/7 in a small homemade rebuilt piecemeal little studio in a garage next to a cow pasture. Yeah, it was rough. We didn't have the correct electricity, so that kind of affected the sound of our equipment. It was a mixed blessing." Carl produced every track on Holland, except for the songs by Dennis Wilson, which Dennis produced himself. In the middle of recording, Dennis moved to the Canary Islands, opting to return to the studio only for certain sessions. Biographer John Stebbins explained that Dennis had not felt comfortable living in Holland.
He wound up withdrawing from Holland pretty quickly. His songs, they were performed by Carl, and he really was very disappointed in losing their support.
Brian did not join most of his bandmates' sessions, instead preferring to work alone on late nights. Sail On Sailor was written primarily by Van Dyke Parks and Brian Wilson. Brian refused to participate on the recording. He later stated, "It's the only song that we did that I absolutely do not like at all. I never liked Sail On Sailor." Though on the documentary Long Promised Road, Brian stated, "That was one of the best songs I ever wrote." Steamboat was written by Dennis and Riley and sung by Carl. The lyrics reference Robert Fulton, the inventor of the steamboat.
Everybody pushing their own material and wondering what was going to be commercial really kind of splintered the most at the Holland period.
Carlin described the song as a dreamlike journey back to the mythical heart of Mark Twain's America, born by the insistent chug of an actual steam engine. California Saga is a 3-part series of songs: Big Sur, The Breaks of Eagles, and California. The members of the group had produced this song when feeling homesick.
I think the California Saga was the last thing we did on that album. I got so homesick I had to write about something.
The Trader is a 2-part composition by Carl with lyrics by Riley, who explained, "The Trader is really about racism. These people who got their orders from the king or queen and colonized Africa, for example. The tender part of the song asks the Africans to reply. I believe it's quite touching. I wasn't consciously trying to do something political." Holland received generally favourable reviews and came to be viewed by many fans as the Beach Boys' last great album. It peaked at number 36 in the US charts. After Holland, the group maintained a touring regimen but recorded very little in the studio for the next 2 years. Several months later, they had announced that they would complete their unfinished album Smile, but this never came to fruition. its plans for release were once again abandoned. Following the June 1973 death of the Wilsons' father and former band manager Murray, Brian retreated into his bedroom and withdrew further into drug abuse, alcoholism, chain smoking and overeating. He reflected, "I used my room as my little castle. Added to that, I was very depressed with the Beach Boys. I couldn't talk to them and nobody in the band could relate to me. This went on for about 2.5 years, but on and off I'd sometimes go and record." The Beach Boys' greatest hits compilation Endless Summer was released in June 1974 to unexpected success, becoming the band's second #1 US album.
We had a resurgence. Capitol re-released the Endless Summer double album, sold platinum, which was huge.
Its success had the effect of returning the group to being the #1 act in the US. Carl recalled, "There was a whole new generation of fans out there and some of them weren't even as old as the songs themselves. Our concerts were selling out and we were singing and playing better than ever." At the end of 1974, Rolling Stone proclaimed the Beach Boys Band of the Year based on the strength of their live performances. To take advantage of their sudden resurgence in popularity, the Beach Boys began recording their next album. 15 Big Ones would feature songs Brian had written with American poet Stephen Kalinich. The title 15 Big Ones referred to both the number of tracks on the album and the group's 15th anniversary. Cover artwork displayed a logo with the band's name and was thereon kept as the Beach Boys logo for decades afterwards. Brian was officially credited as the sole producer for the first time on a Beach Boys LP since Pet Sounds. Jardine later reported that the group were unsure if Brian possessed the competence to produce an album. The band had quickly realised that Brian no longer had the energy or desire to get anything right. Without Brian's knowledge, members of the band later touched up the recordings in opposition to his desire for a dry sound. A Newsweek journalist reported that Jardine and Mike Love were all for letting Brian take full charge, even though Love makes no secret of resenting him. According to sources, a lot of the people in the studio felt sorry for Brian and tried to help him improve his work, with the exception of Love and Jardine, who just thought it was crap. It's Okay, written by Brian and Mike, is an upbeat song about celebrating summer fun. Had to Phone You was written by Wilson while his wife Marilyn was away in Europe. Everyone in Love with You, written about the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, was Mike Love's second ever solo contribution to a Beach Boys album. That same song was described by Carlin as a whimsical history of world music that came close to sparking the gospel fire it set out to ignite. TM's song begins with a mock argument between the band's members, possibly based on the real-life arguments that had been occurring amongst themselves. 8 cover songs featured on the album: Rock and Roll Music, originally by Chuck Berry, Chapel of Love by Darlene Love, Talk to Me by Little Willie John, Palisades Park by Freddie Cannon, A Casual Look by the 16s, Blueberry Hill by Fats Domino, In the Still of the Night by the Five Satins, and Just Once in My Life by the Righteous Brothers. To highlight Brian's recovery and his return to writing and producing, a promotional campaign was devised with the tagline, "Brian is back."
As an observer of the Brian's Back campaign, brilliant and bogus.
Brian had admitted himself into 24-hour therapy before the making of the album under psychiatrist Dr. Eugene Landy.
It looked like Brian was really coming back.
15 Big Ones was largely disliked by the group's fan base. Much of the criticism centres around the cover songs, Dennis's and Brian's rough vocal performances, and the record's perceived unfinished, forced and rushed quality. The Village Voice described the album as the kind of music one might expect to find at a rock star's funeral. AllMusic's John Bush felt that most of the covers were simply too well known to be reworked effectively by anyone. At the time, Brian described the album as nothing too deep and promised that his next effort would be as ambitious as Good Vibrations. The album peaked at 30 on the US charts. Under Dr. Landy's care, Brian became more stable and socially engaged, with his productivity increasing once again. Asked in a December 1976 interview about his feelings on a solo career, Brian responded that he would like to release a solo album. However, he did not want to deal with the inner band politics that would result from him becoming a solo artist.
Well, I told the boys, I said, I'll produce you an album if you want me to.
The Beach Boys' Love You marked the first time Brian was given full reign on a new Beach Boys album since the Smile sessions in 1967. He wrote almost the entire album and performed nearly every instrument, including keyboards, synthesizers, and drums.
The Beach Boys' Love You was probably my favorite album that we ever did. It just hit the spot, I loved it.
Carl and Dennis contributed some instrumentation, while Jardine and Love were rarely present for the sessions.
It should be a good album. It should be a very good album. I'm going to call the album Brian's in Love. I don't think they'll go for it, though.
It was essentially a Brian Wilson solo album, with only brief contributions by other members of the band who added their parts after the bulk of the work was finished. Let Us Go On This Way is a rock song in which the narrator, a young man, expresses to his object of affection, "To get you babe, I went through the ringer, ain't gonna let you slip through my finger," followed by a plea for God to "Let us get on this way." Wilson said he wrote the song with Mike Love when they found that the rest of the album sounded too deadpan and we needed something up-tempo.
And the feeling in the Beach Boys is mostly positive and fun.
Yeah, are you kidding? Have you seen the problems here? But the group has tremendous difficulties.
Roller Skating Child elaborates on the themes of the previous track. Mona is a 1950s style love song with only 4 chords. The lyrics discuss some of Wilson's favourite songs by Phil Spector. Good Time is a song about a man who declares of his various girlfriends, "Maybe it won't last, but what do we care? My baby and I just want a good time." Ding Dang is a short song consisting of a single verse and chorus that Wilson wrote with the Byrds' Roger McGuinn in the early 1970s. McGuinn recalled that Brian had one day visited his home for amphetamines. After they worked together on the song and McGuinn went to bed, the next morning he found that Wilson was still awake playing Ding Dang on the piano. Only one lyric was ever written: "I love a girl and I love her madly, I treat her so fine, but she treats me so badly." Solar System discusses the solar system in a similar vein as the band's 1965 hit California Girls. Let's Put Our Hearts Together is a duet between Wilson and his first wife Marilyn. In the song they discuss the insecurities they feel for each other before coming together to see what we can cook up between us. On release, reviews were divided, some of whom saw the album as a work of eccentric genius, whereas others dismissed it as childish and trivial. The Beach Boys' Love You reached number 53 on the US charts.
Brian did go through that Brian's Back album period of the 15 big ones and all that, and then a period of decline after that.
At the beginning of 1977, the Beach Boys had enjoyed their most lucrative concert tours ever, with the band playing in packed stadiums and earning up to $150,000 per show. The Beach Boys intended to record 2 albums, with one at the Maharishi International University, or MIU for short. Mike chose this venue to keep members of the band away from their drug suppliers in Los Angeles. At MIU, the group and their family members took residence in the university's circular dorm rooms, as well as attending meditation classes and meetings. The album would be titled MIU and was produced by Al Jardine and a keyboardist who toured with the band. In a 1995 interview, Brian stated that he could not remember making the album, claiming that he had gone through a mental blackout during this period. Despite this, he was credited as the album's executive producer. According to Mike, Carl and Dennis took the whole experience as a personal affront, and they came and went with little interest in the music. Brian was with us, but miserable throughout. The less said about the songs, the better. MIU album was met with confusion from critics and fans. and continues to be widely regarded as one of the Beach Boys' worst albums. According to music critic Nick Kent, the album was so dreadful that its pitiful content was ignored by critics. The album peaked at 151 on the US charts. By the late 1970s, the Beach Boys were in a state of professional and personal disarray, with the Wilson brothers struggling with drug abuse and alongside Mike Love, each facing an imminent or ongoing divorce from their wives. The 1978 tour, while highly successful, was disastrous and nearly resulted in another breakup when the group discovered that Dennis had purchased heroin for Brian Wilson with funds allegedly acquired from Carl Wilson. After returning to Los Angeles, Brian ran away on days-long drug binges and was later discovered lying under a tree at Balboa Park in San Diego without shoes, money or a wallet. Their next album, LA, contained little involvement from Brian or Dennis. A friend recalled, "Brian was real weird then, real quiet, not saying much, real depressed. I think he just realised he wasn't going to be able to pick up the slack." Brian eventually suggested that Bruce Johnston be brought back in to help produce the album. It was later said, if Brian sang a note anywhere on the album, his voice was so far down in the mix as to be completely unidentifiable. Mike described LA as mainly a collection of solo efforts. Dennis was opposed to the recording and Brian did not participate. Another older song, Good Timing, had been taken from sessions in 1974. Among the newer songs, Carl contributed 3, Angel Come Home, Full Sail and Going South, that he wrote with songwriter Jeffrey Cushing Murray. Dennis's 2 songs, Baby Blue and Love Surrounds Me, were lifted from his in-progress Bamboo album. Biographer John Stebbins states that the songs were included at the insistence of Dennis's bandmates. Music journalist Dominic Pryor summarised, "They obviously didn't have enough good material for their album on their new label, so they nicked some of the better songs from Bamboo." Mike Love's Summer Harmer is lyrically inspired by his fiancée at the time, a woman named Samuka, and is about a young girl who wants to go with her mother to a place called Sumahama in search of her father.
What is it? What is Sumahama? Sumahama is a place in Japan where the lovers walk along the sand.
It was a critical and commercial failure, peaking at 100 on the US charts. Rolling Stone's Dave Marsh wrote, "The Beach Boys have not made great rock music since Wild Honey and have not made competent pop music since Holland." He went on to say, "The album is worse than awful. It's irrelevant." AllMusic reviewer John Bush felt, "The Beach Boys ended the decade by releasing the worst album of their career, describing it as yet another oddball attempt to push the Beach Boys into a contemporary mainstream despite their many songwriting and production flaws." With the failure of LA, the group wanted Brian to return as their producer.
A 1, a 2, a 1, 2, 3, go!
They were briefly successful. As Carl Wilson said, Brian got hot for about 3 days in the studio. He was singing like a bird. He came out of himself. He was right there in the room. Dennis Wilson, at odds with the rest of the group, abandoned the initial recording sessions, taking no further part in the album. Bruce Johnston rejoined the band at this point and took complete control of the production. Keeping the Summer Alive included a mixture of brand new songs alongside older songs that had not been released up until that point. This would be the final album to feature Dennis Wilson, as he would drown in 1983. When Girls Get Together was recorded in 1969 and is the only song on the album featuring Dennis. The song Endless Harmony had been started in 1972 and was originally titled 10 Years. The band recorded Santa Ana Winds in 1978, revising and re-recording some of the song for this album. In 2013, Bruce Johnston expressed dissatisfaction with the production of the title track, which he perceived as being weaker sounding due to Carl's intervention. Predictably, the album was met with negative reviews. AllMusic referred to keeping Summer alive as the low point in the band's discography. He stated, "Ripe with mindless throwaways and lifeless filler, the two exceptions to the rule reside in the title track and the closing endless harmony." The album peaked at number 75 in the US charts. Their next self-titled album, The Beach Boys, was intended as a comeback following the death of Dennis Wilson.
We know that Dennis would like us to continue in the spirit and tradition of the Beach Boys.
It was also the band's first album to be recorded digitally. Brian's psychologist Eugene Landy was originally awarded co-writing credits on Wilson's songs, stating in a contemporary interview, "I'm practically a member of the band. Brian's got the talent to make the music. He's the creator. The other band members are just performers, so I'm the one who's making the album."
I happen to have a music background. I happen to be bright.
Eugene Landy originally received co-writing credits for all Brian Wilson compositions. This credit was omitted on later editions. Critical reaction was mixed. Rolling Stone called the album pretty entertaining, adding, "Though not a world-beating act of artistic reassertion, the LP does serve to showcase those amazing voices and to remind the world that nobody does it better still." The album peaked at number 52 on the US charts. After Kokomo was released as a single from the Cocktail film soundtrack, it gave the Beach Boys their first number one hit in the US since 1966's Good Vibrations.
I thought Kokomo was really great. I didn't get to be on that one.
Thereafter, the band decided to put together an album of recent and classical songs. The classical songs included had been heard in recent films. The songs Still Cruisin', Somewhere Near Japan and Island Girl were recorded for the album by the touring Beach Boys band, as well as studio musicians and producer Terry Melcher. Due to his ongoing relationship with Dr. Eugene Landy, Brian Wilson's lone contribution to the album was In My Car, a song credited as being co-written by Landy and his girlfriend Alexandra Morgan. Around this time, the Beach Boys teamed with the Fat Boys to release a rap song. It was terrible beyond belief. Mike Love said of the album, "The theme of that album was to have been songs that have been in movies. It was basically a repackage, but then it got watered down with politics, meaning Brian's Dr. Landy forcing a car song called In My Car, which was never in a movie, and a song by Al Jardine, which ultimately ended up on the album called Island Girl, which was never in a movie either. So to me, the concept was a little bit diluted there politically." Riding on the cocktails of Kokomo, Still Cruising went gold in the US and Australia. It gave the Beach Boys their best chart showing since 1976. During Capitol's Beach Boys reissue campaign in 2000 and 2001, Still Cruising was left behind and allowed to go out of print. The Beach Boys' next album, Summer in Paradise, produced by Terry Melcher, was the only album not to feature any new contributions from Brian Wilson. The idea behind the album's title song, co-written by Mike Love, was environmental protection, but the album was designed, in Love's words, to create the quintessential soundtrack of summer. Summer in Paradise was one of the first albums to be recorded using the Pro Tools software. Musically, it continued in the vein of previous albums The Beach Boys and Still Cruising in its use of electronic instrumentation. The entire rhythm section was electronic on most songs, with all of the drum parts being programmed and most of the bass parts were also synthesized. Former Beach Boys creator Van Dyke Parks played accordion on 2 tracks and produced Terry Melcher contributing keyboard parts, with Al Jardine's son Adam singing backup vocals on the title track. Summer in Paradise was received very poorly. In fact, the album did so poorly it failed to even chart. This marked the lowest point the Beach Boys had ever reached. In North America, it was the group's first album to only be released on CD and cassette, with a rare vinyl pressing only released in South Korea. It reportedly sold fewer than 1,000 copies on its release, making it the Beach Boys album with by far the poorest commercial sales performance. A large number of unsold copies of the album were unloaded when the QVC network bundled them with the Good Vibrations 30 Years of the Beach Boys CD box set in 1993. Stars and Stripes Volume 1 was the 28th studio album by the Beach Boys. The album was a collaborative album between the Beach Boys and various country acts. According to Wilson's wife Melinda, during the album's recording, the Beach Boys treated Brian like an invalid, all the time saying, "Do this, don't do that, are you okay?" Stars and Stripes became the last studio album to feature Carl Wilson, who died in 1998. The track listing contained all covers from the Beach Boys' previous hits with no new material. Again, reviews were abysmal. Music critic Stephen Thomas Erwin stated, "The release was an unimaginative disaster and an outright embarrassment for all involved. The album's failure prevented Brian from securing a record contract." The album peaked at 101 on the US charts. In 2010, Brian called producer Joe Thomas saying that he had some ideas for new Beach Boys songs. The two proceeded to meet with Mike Love in Palm Springs, who then agreed to a collaboration. On December 16, 2011, it was announced that Brian Wilson, Mike Love, Al Jardine, Bruce Johnston and David Marks would reunite for a new album and the Beach Boys' 50th anniversary reunion tour. Many of the songs were written in collaboration with Thomas, whose input sometimes included entire chord progressions. According to Bruce Johnston, the album's overall aesthetics compares to their 1970 album Sunflower. The album's title track, That's Why God Made the Radio, was written by Brian Wilson, Jim Patrick, Joe Thomas and Larry Milas back in the 1990s. 80 hours worth of demo tapes were secured from that period. The track Summer's Gone was originally meant to be the final song on the Beach Boys album. According to Thomas, the album's original title was Summer's Gone, with the intention that it would be the final Beach Boys album. It was changed when Brian decided he would like to record a follow-up. The song was written in reflection of his mother's death and the end of Carl's life, who died 2 months after their mother. Whereas songs like From There to Back Again, Isn't It Time, Beaches in Mind, Shelter and The Private Life of Bill and Sue were written for the new album. Thomas describes the two sides of the album as the dark side and the sunny side, and also believed that it was important for a Beach Boys album to have a sunny side catering to both hardcore Brian Wilson fans and Beach Boys fans. It received generally favourable reviews, and reviewers unanimously highlighted the album's 4-song closing suite as its crowning moments. The Guardian touted, "The best thing Brian Wilson has put to his name in the last 30 years." That wraps up the Beach Boys albums. Thanks for watching.